Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into one of the most provocative, rigorous, and frankly necessary works of the late 20th century, Walter Rodney's 1973 masterpiece, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
It's a book that really just hits you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
It's an intellectual seismic event because it completely flips the script on how we're taught to understand global inequality.
It really does.
When we look at, poverty or stagnation or political instability in parts of Africa today, the conventional narratives, the standard stories we all hear, they almost always point the finger inward.
Right. If you're in a meeting or you're reading a news report or even just, talking about history, you hear these talking points all the time.
All the time.
The explanations tend to focus on things like, oh, they lack the necessary skills or infrastructure or...
They suffer from inherent political instability, corruption, tribal conflict.
Exactly. Or maybe their political institutions just weren't mature enough at the moment of independence. It's always an internal problem.
And that approach right there, that's the crisis in perception. It puts the entire burden of explanation, and so the entire moral burden, squarely on local factors. It implies there was some kind of fundamental cultural or institutional deficiency that Africa just couldn't overcome on its own. It's a narrative of failure.
And that is precisely the narrative that Walter Rodney set out to completely dismantle. So our mission today is to really unpack Rodney's breathtaking reframing. African underdevelopment isn't a failure of character or history or culture. It's a systematic historical process.
A very long one.
We're talking 5 centuries. From the 15th century, when European contact began, right up to the end of the colonial period in the 1960s. And the key word is active. This was an active process.
We're going to be focusing squarely on the external systems, the structural forces that produce this outcome.
Right.
So we're talking about the systematic operation of European capitalism, colonialism, and the creation of what he calls structural dependence. The argument is that these forces didn't just stumble upon an already backward continent.
Wow.
They actively restricted, they distorted, and they drained a developing one.
So our core question for this deep dive, and it's drawn directly from Rodney's analysis, is really twofold, and it's deeply relevant today. First, how was Africa fundamentally restricted from making maximum independent use of its own economic, technological, and political potential across those 5 centuries?
And second, and maybe this is the more urgent question for today, why does such a huge portion of the wealth that's generated by African labor and resources still flow outside the continent?
Let's unpack this. Before we dive into the mechanisms, we absolutely have to situate the author and the context of the book itself, because this isn't just an academic text.
Not at all. It was an act of political engagement. We're talking about Walter Rodney.
So who was this pivotal figure?
Walter Rodney was, an intellectual powerhouse. He's often described as a towering figure in post-colonial thought. He was Guyanese, trained as a historian, and he held positions all over the Caribbean and Africa. But critically, he saw himself as more than that. He was an economist, a historian, and fundamentally a revolutionary anti-colonial thinker.
So he was committed to linking theory with practice.
Absolutely. He saw his scholarship not as some, abstract academic thing, but as a tool for struggle, for liberation, and for transformation.
He got his PhD in London, but then he spent a lot of time teaching and living in Tanzania. Right. Specifically Dar es Salaam, which is where this book was published in 1973.
Yes, and that location is key.
Why is that?
Well, Tanzania at that time, under Julius Nyerere, was a hub of radical anti-colonial thought. They were advocating for African socialism, for self-reliance. It was a hotbed of revolutionary ideas.
So the book really reflects that spirit.
It does. It wasn't written to impress, the tenure committees at Oxford or Harvard.
Right.
Rodney says it explicitly. His purpose was to try and reach Africans who wanted to explore the nature of their own exploitation, to give them the conceptual tools to understand the system.
So he wasn't trying to satisfy the so-called standards set by their oppressors.
Exactly, or their spokesman in the academic world. That distinction writing for the oppressed, not for the oppressors, is what makes this work so incredibly radical.
And that commitment, that activism, it had very serious consequences for him personally.
It did, and we have to pause and reflect on that. His intellectual rigor was completely inseparable from his political activism. Rodney wasn't just observing history, he was trying to shape it. And his commitment to grassroots organization and political mobilization ultimately led to his assassination in Guyana in 1980.
Wow.
That alone is just a powerful testament to how dangerous this kind of systemic critique was and still is to the established order. This wasn't just theory for Rodney. It was a life-or-death political document.
So, if he was writing to arm these newly liberated nations with a framework for understanding their situation, what was the mainstream academic establishment saying at the time that he was pushing back against so hard?
The mainstream bourgeois writers, as he calls them, were heavily invested in justifying the global status quo.
And specifically justifying capitalism.
Specifically, they explained inequality through these overly simplistic rich nation, poor nation dichotomies. And Rodney noted that they deliberately avoided naming the system.
What do you mean?
Well, terms like capitalist and socialist rarely entered their discussion. They prefer to talk about industrialized versus unindustrialized or developed versus developing nations
Why does that semantic difference matter so much?
because it completely masks the relationship. If
Yeah.
you say a nation is unindustrialized, it sounds like an accident or maybe a stage they just haven't reached yet.
Uh-huh.
But if you say they are exploited by the capitalist system, now you're talking about an active mechanism. You're
Yep.
talking about wealth transfer.
So Rodney saw the mainstream vocabulary as a kind of intellectual fog.
Exactly. It was a way of avoiding the uncomfortable truth that one side's richness was built on the other side's impoverishment.
Which brings us right to the heart of it. The book's central thesis. Let's just state it as clearly as we can because it is audaciously simple, but it's also profoundly difficult for a lot of people to accept.
Okay, the core thesis is this. Africa's current structural state, its underdevelopment, was actively produced through European capitalism and imperialism.
So not benign neglect.
No, it was deliberate restriction, extraction, and distortion.
And here's the inseparable twin concept, the other side of the coin.
Right. European development, the accumulation of capital, the industrialization they achieved, the technical skills they mastered, all of that was inseparable from and entirely dependent upon the active exploitation of Africa.
So the draining of African wealth and the structural restrictions placed on Africa's ability to develop itself.
It's two sides of the same coin forged over 5 centuries. They developed. We underdeveloped. They are not parallel processes. They are sequential and interdependent.
Okay. That moves us from the context into the core ideas. Let's look at the actual mechanisms that produce this inequality. The first thing Rodney does is make sure we're all using the right language, which means defining terms with real precision. So what does he mean by development? Because it's not just about money, which is critical.
No, absolutely not. For Rodney, development is a universal long-term historical process. He defines it as a society's increased capacity for dealing with its environment.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
It means advancing in science, in technology, the creation of tools, and maybe most fundamentally in the way work is organized, what you'd call the social relations of production.
It's a constant visible progress then, moving from just having more of something to having something qualitatively different.
Yes, he gives the analogy of early humans moving from crude stone tools to sophisticated ironworking, or a society moving from a communal setting where everyone kind of does everything to one with highly specialized functions, skilled artisans, bureaucrats, specialized farmers, replacing the generalists.
That's the engine of history, he argues.
It is. I mean, look at Europe's own internal development, the move from a slave-based economy to feudalism. Slavery eventually became a brake on productivity because slaves had no motivation and their tools were limited. When serfdom replaced slavery, it created new social relations that incentivized production and allowed for this, temporary burst of advancement. Rodney's point is that this capacity building, this historical movement, is universal. Every human society was doing it.
So if that's the universal process of development, how does he define underdevelopment? Because it's not what most people think.
No. Underdevelopment is absolutely not the absence of development. Every society is developed in some way, even if it's uneven. Underdevelopment only makes sense as a means of comparison.
And a very specific kind of comparison.
Right. And crucially, it expresses a specific relationship of exploitation of one country by another. The underdevelopment we're talking about today, which is structural and long-lasting, is explicitly a product of capitalist, imperialist, and colonialist exploitation.
That distinction is so important. It's not about being primitive or behind the curve.
No.
It's about being structurally disfigured by external intentional forces that restrict your own independent advancement.
Precisely. And this leads directly to his core concept of structural dependence. African economies become integrated into the structure of developed capitalist economies, but in a way that is fundamentally unfavorable.
They become satellites.
That's a great way to put it. They become satellites, orbiting the metropolitan economies, rather than developing an internal, self-sustaining gravity of their own.
So when a mine opens in a West African country, it might be physically there.
But structurally and financially, it's integrated vertically into London or New York. The big decisions, what to produce, how much to produce, where to sell it, and most importantly, where the profits go, are all made in the metropole, in the imperial center.
And the resulting structure ensures the systematic export of economic surplus.
And it deprives Africa the beneficial, self-propelling effects of its own resources and its own labor. This is the definition of structural dependence. A lasting, unfavorable integration into the global system.
This brings us back to the pre-colonial era before this integration took hold. Rodney spends a huge amount of the book tackling this myth that Africa was static, just a jumble of tribes waiting for Europe to arrive. Why did he dedicate so much space to that historical rebuttal?
Because he had to. He had to establish internal capacity. He had to prove that Africa was on a moving train, that development was possible, and in fact it was happening.
So that the later underdevelopment could be accurately labeled as an external act of restriction.
Exactly. Before the 15th century, Africa was developing along universal historical lines. It showed clear historical movement, with many societies moving from communalism toward forms of feudalism or other highly complex stratified systems.
So what are some of the examples of pre-colonial technological and political complexity that Rodney highlights to prove this trajectory?
Well, on the technological front, he shows that African manufacturers had advanced a great deal, particularly in specialized production. We're talking about sophisticated cloth weaving, advanced pottery techniques, and this is a big one, high-quality ironworking.
And iron tools supported everything.
Everything, from agriculture to warfare. And then Rodney reminds us of the verdict of art historians on the famous If and Benin bronzes from the 14th and 15th centuries. These aren't crude artifacts. They're works of incredible technical sophistication. They place African artistic achievement firmly within a global timeline of development.
And politically, we're not talking about small villages. We see complex, large-scale state formations that were responding to internal pressures, just like states in Asia or Europe.
Absolutely. Think of the Western Sudan, the great trading states of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These were sophisticated political entities that existed for centuries.
And while the gold trade flowed north across the Sahara, which stimulated wealth,
The real engine of their society was still agriculture. Millet and rice farming, supported by their iron tools and livestock. Their socio-political complexity evolved to manage and protect those resources and trade routes.
then you move southeast to the interlacustrine zone, the Great Lakes region, where we see these really unique forms of class and caste stratification emerging.
States like Bunyoro, Buganda, and especially Rwanda show accelerated state formation driven by internal dynamics. In Rwanda, the interplay between the pastoralist Batutsi Bahima and the cultivator Bahuju Bairu led to a highly sophisticated system.
And the key institution there was Obuhek.
Yes, the control over cattle.
Okay, so for the listener, what exactly does control over cattle signify in this context? Why did Rodney single that out?
Because it's essentially a highly feudal system of social relations. In Rwanda, cattle were the primary form of mobile wealth and a means of production.
Right.
Ubuhake was a contract. A herdsman, often Batutsi, would grant cattle to a client, often Bahutu, and this created a permanent relationship of dependency and obligation.
So it cemented class stratification.
It did. The cattle owners had the power, and it created a complex, hierarchical political system centered on controlling economic resources. This shows internal political movement, not stagnation.
So to just hammer home Rodney's core point on this historical section, African societies were in motion. They were developing their own political and technological answers to their own needs.
Yes.
Europe did not arrive to save a stagnant continent. Europe arrived and actively derailed a moving train.
That's the perfect analogy. And this brings us to the first great mechanism of underdevelopment, the transatlantic slave trade, starting in the 15th century.
The moment European ships gained naval superiority in the Atlantic, the entire dynamic just changed forever. Europe took the initiative, and this shift was fundamental, and it was aggressive.
It was. European naval power allowed them to control all the major international trade routes, and they established themselves as the necessary global middlemen.
And in doing so, they consciously broke existing African commercial links.
Yes, and aggressively. For example, the trade connections between Benin and the Gold Coast, or the long-established trans-Saharan routes that connected West Africa to the Arab North. They severed all the horizontal links and created a new vertical one,
A vertical one connecting Africa only to Europe.
only to Europe. And Europe's primary demand then dictated Africa's new role in the global economy.
And that role was devastating.
Africa was allocated the specific, horrific role of supplier of human captives. This was driven by the intense labor needs of the new American plantation system: sugar, cotton, tobacco.
And the drain on the population was massive.
It was completely economically irrational from the perspective of African development. Rodney notes that while every other continent was seeing a natural population increase, Africa stagnated or even regressed over those centuries. It lost its most productive, its youngest, its most skilled people.
But the economic damage went so far beyond just population loss, didn't it? This caused a fundamental distortion that set the continent back centuries.
Oh, the technological arrest is arguably the most critical long-term effect of the slave trade.
How so?
Europe flooded African markets with three main things: cheap manufactured goods, alcohol, and weapons. And these imports did two things at the same time.
First, they displaced local African industries.
Yes. For example, a local African iron smelter or a cloth weaver simply could not compete with the cheaper, mass-produced textiles and ironware pouring in from Europe.
So by cutting off African producers from their own local demand?
The system caused what Rodney calls technological arrest, or even regression. The incentive to innovate just vanished. Why would you try to improve your smelting furnace if European iron is always cheaper?
It's the classic economic trap. The imported product is made using techniques that are subsidized by exploitation, which makes the locally produced goods seem economically pointless.
And so the local industry dies.
And the skill base that you need for the next stage of development is lost.
Exactly. People actively forgot the simple techniques their forefathers had used, like sophisticated iron smelting, because they had been structurally removed from the marketplace. The continent lost its chance to move from craft production to an early industrial scale because its market was preemptively flooded and strangled by European imports.
And the reverse side of this is the massive subsidy that's provided to Europe. Let's spend some time on this because this is where Rodney's analysis is just so powerful.
Yeah.
The direct connection between African suffering and European industrial ascendancy.
The slave trade and the subsequent exploitation of raw materials and tropical produce were an absolutely massive source of initial capital accumulation in Europe.
We're not talking about pocket change here.
No, this was the foundational investment capital, the primary accumulation that launched the Industrial Revolution.
And we're talking specific numbers and flows. The profits were injected directly into these burgeoning sectors.
Precisely. The profits from the slave trade and the plantations were reinvested into shipping, insurance, joint stock companies, and banking. I mean, take the rise of the textile industry in Lancashire. The cotton that was grown by enslaved labor in the Americas, subsidized by African loss of lives, fed those mills. The capital accumulated by ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes, their entire prosperity, was directly linked to slave trading profits.
So these profits didn't just enrich a few individuals, they financed the very innovations we credit for industrialization.
They absolutely did. Think about the mechanical innovations. Who was buying shares in the early canal companies or the railroads or the banks that financed the invention of new machinery, like the flying shuttle or the power loom?
He was often the merchant class.
Whose wealth originated in the triangulation of the slave trade. Rodney insists that Europe's industrial takeoff was not some magical internal event. It was heavily subsidized by African extraction and the brutal efficiency of slave labor.
The scale of this violence, the economic distortion, the technological arrest, all of it had to be justified ideologically, and this is where racism becomes institutionalized.
Rodney argues that the prolonged enslavement and exploitation of millions of non-white peoples inevitably generated white racism. It was a necessary mechanism.
How so?
No people can enslave and dehumanize another for centuries without developing a deep-seated notion of their own moral and racial superiority to rationalize the barbarism.
So racism wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct.
No, it became the ideological justification for further domination and exploitation during the next phase, the colonial era.
Which brings us to that second most visible form of systematic exploitation, colonialism, running from the late 19th century through the mid-20th. This intensified the extraction dramatically and finalized that structural dependence.
Colonialism put the whole system on steroids. It moved from simply trading for captives and coastal goods to reorganizing entire African economies for hyper-efficient extraction of raw materials.
Okay, let's look first at the large-scale industrial extraction. the mechanism of expatriation of surplus through mining.
This is just clear wealth drainage. In places like southern Africa and the Congo, super profits were generated from gold, diamonds, copper. In northern Rhodesia, which is modern Zambia, Rodney details that fully half of the wealth generated by the copper mines was systematically expatriated every year.
It just didn't stay in the country.
No, it flowed out to shareholders in Europe.
And the numbers for a company like Union Minière de Haute-Katanga in the Belgian Congo, they're just staggering. They really illustrate how this system works.
They are. Union Minière reported profits that sometimes exceeded 27 million pounds in a single year.
Which at the time was an astronomical sum.
An astronomical sum. And this immense wealth was generated by African labor, often forced under horrific conditions, yet the profits flowed directly back to shareholders in Brussels, London, and New York.
And the system was designed to ensure minimal reinvestment in local development.
Minimal. It created this vast disparity between the wealth being generated and the social conditions of the workers who generated it.
Then there's the exploitation of the vast majority, the African peasant farmer who wasn't necessarily working in a corporate mine.
Right. And here, European trading companies like the United Africa Company or UAC, CFAO, SESCIO, they established monopolies. And they profited by paying extremely low controlled prices for cash crops like cocoa, groundnuts, or palm oil. The African peasant had to grow these crops, sometimes by force, just to pay the new colonial hut taxes or head taxes imposed by the administration.
And the system exploited the peasants' ability to sustain themselves through subsistence farming.
This is the cynical efficiency of it. Because the peasant could still feed their family from their traditional subsistence plots, the colonial companies didn't have to worry about paying a genuine living wage for the cash crop labor.
So they were getting tribute from a conquered people.
Without having to absorb the full social reproduction costs of the labor force. Peasants worked long hours for these minimal dictated incomes, which, when you translate that into the low price of primary goods, it represents an extreme exploitation of African labor hours.
And structurally, this completely dismantled Africa's traditional diversified agriculture, replacing it with the highly risky system of monoculture.
Monoculture was a system engineered purely to meet specific European industrial demands. Senegal and Gambia, for instance, were reorganized to produce 85 to 90% groundnuts.
The Gold Coast was heavily focused on cocoa.
Right. And this meant that the economic survival of these entire territories was tied to the fluctuating global price of just one or two commodities.
That sounds like engineered vulnerability.
It absolutely is. It made these economies highly vulnerable to global price drops, to pests, to disease. If the price of cocoa collapsed, the entire Gold Coast economy crashed.
And even worse.
Since food crops had been replaced by cash crops, it created systemic risks of food shortages and even famines. They were growing these rich crops for Europe, but they were often unable to feed themselves.
And finally, the infrastructure itself, the roads, the rails, was physically designed to perpetuate this structural dependence.
This is the clearest physical manifestation of underdevelopment, what Rodney calls structural distortion.
Okay, what does he mean by that?
Colonial infrastructure was built exclusively to facilitate the flow of raw materials from the interior to the European metropole, or at least to the coastal ports. It was an extraction network.
Right.
And critically, this structure ensured that economic relations between neighboring African colonies were basically non-existent.
Is the Accra d'Abidjan telephone call the perfect, almost absurd illustration of this that Rodney uses?
It is the most telling anecdote. Accra, in the British Gold Coast, was tied to London. Abidjan, in the French Ivory Coast, was tied to Paris.
Right next to each other.
Right next to each other.
Oh.
But if you wanted to place a telephone call between these two neighboring colonial capitals, a matter of a few hundred miles, you couldn't call directly.
You had to route the call through London and Paris.
Yes, you needed two separate international connections. Their economies were connected vertically to the metropole, not horizontally to each other. That is, structural dependence made physical.
The system Rodney maps out wasn't chaotic at all. It was an exploitation machine, perfectly tailored for capitalism in its imperialist phase. Let's trace the key components of this system, starting with the actors. Who was running the show?
You can identify the key groups controlling the strategy. First, at the very top, you have the metropolitan capitalists and financiers.
So these are the shareholders.
These are the shareholders of the massive mining giants, like De Beers or Union Minière, the powerful trading companies like Unilever's UAC, and the global bankers, like Barclays, Lloyds, Société Générale. They held the ownership, and dictated the strategy.
But they couldn't operate without political and military power on the ground.
And that's the second actor, the European states and colonial administrations. Their role was crucial. They provided political monopoly power, military force to crush resistance.
Like the brutal suppression of the Maji-Maji resistance in Tanganyika.
Exactly. And they set up the regulatory systems, they established tariffs, laws about land, and critically, the financial mechanisms like the currency boards, all designed to ensure the maximum protected advantage for their own national capitalists.
And then on the African side, you had two groups that enabled the system to function at a local level.
Well, the vast majority were the forced workers and peasants. Their cheap labor and their resources were the entire foundation of the system.
But there was also a minority class.
Yes, the comprador agents. These were African rulers or members of the educated elite or local traders who served as essential middlemen. They managed the lower levels of administration, they helped collect taxes, they organized the flow of goods. And in doing so, they often hardened internal class divisions, but they were always operating within the constraints set by Europe.
Looking at the incentives, it's just a pure study in asymmetry. The whole system was geared toward the metropole.
Absolutely. The incentives for the metropole were crystal clear. Capital accumulation, maximizing profit, securing reliable, cheap, strategic raw materials.
Like the push by Firestone to acquire vast Liberian rubber plantations.
Right, to get around high prices in Asia, and of course, expanding industrial employment back home. The colonial subject was just a means to achieve those ends.
And for the African elite who collaborated, the incentive was simply survival or status or access to European goods.
Pretty much. But none of this extraction could operate without the necessary window dressing.
The narratives.
That's where the narratives come in. The civilizing mission, modernization, progress, these were the essential ideological masks used to hide the raw economic nature of colonialism.
And Rodney just exposes this hypocrisy perfectly.
He does. He points to the Portuguese, who boasted of having a 500-year civilizing mission. Yet when Guinea-Bissau finally achieved independence in the 1970s, it was left with practically no functional infrastructure, a 98% illiteracy rate, and only a handful of African doctors.
So the narrative was completely divorced from the reality.
Utterly. And underpinning all of that was the foundational narrative of African cultural or racial deficiency.
This narrative justified everything.
Everything. It justified low wages, minimal social services. Rodney pointedly contrasts the meager 7 shillings and 4 pence spent per person in Ghana in the 1930s versus the 6 pounds and 15 shillings spent per person in the UK.
And it justified the denial of political power.
It did. Racism, which was already established during the slave trade, became institutionalized and codified in policy to maintain control and extraction without any moral scrutiny.
So let's trace the crucial economic feedback loop, how this system became so perfectly self-perpetuating, ensuring that once it started, it was almost impossible for Africa to catch up.
It's a machine that runs on itself. The process begins with extraction. African manual labor and raw resources, gold, cocoa, palm oil flow out of the continent, either as profits or through low commodity prices.
Okay.
This surplus capital and raw material then fuels European growth. It fuels their industrialization, their technological advance, their organizational sophistication.
So the economic benefit just compounds in Europe. What happens in Africa?
That European sophistication immediately creates the third stage, African dependency. African economies are strictly restricted to producing raw commodities, and they become entirely reliant on imports from Europe.
And this is crucial because it ensures technological stagnation in Africa. There are no beneficial backward and forward linkages.
Right.
Let's explain that linkage concept for the listener. What is a backward or forward linkage?
So when an industry grows, it usually stimulates other industries. A backward linkage is when growth in one sector stimulates demand for inputs from another.
For instance, if you build a car factory.
Right, the final product. You stimulate demand for steel, glass, rubber, specialized tools, the inputs. A forward linkage is when a product from one sector becomes an input for another. If you produce cheap, quality steel, you stimulate the local construction or machinery industries.
So in Africa, the cocoa production had no linkages.
Precisely. If Ghana produced cocoa, the forward linkage making chocolate happened in Switzerland. The backward linkage making the machinery to process the cocoa happened in Germany or Britain.
So all the wealth generated by the multiplier effect of innovation and industrial growth happened in Europe.
Yes, leaving African economies hollowed out, perpetually dependent on buying back the finished goods that were derived from their own resources.
And that dependency necessitates the final stage of the loop, continued extraction.
Because Africa lacks the productive capacity to create for its own needs, It must continue to rely on metropolitan finance banks, shipping, loans, and manufactured goods. This just deepens the structural relationship of exploitation. The system consumes its own tail, ensuring the capital always returns to the center, to the metropole.
One of the most cynical and effective mechanisms for ensuring this capital flow, this pure financial scam that Rodney details, is the currency board system. We need to spend some time on this because it's a highly technical point, but it perfectly illustrates the intentionality of the underdevelopment.
It is the ultimate example of state-sponsored financial theft. The currency boards were set up by colonial governments, mainly in the British sphere, in the early 20th century. Here's how it worked.
Okay.
A colony like Ghana sells its cocoa to a European buyer. That cocoa generates export earnings, usually in British pounds sterling.
So Ghana earns sterling. Where does that money go?
The currency board required those export earnings, the actual hard foreign currency, to be physically held as sterling reserves in Britain, usually in London banks or the British Treasury.
And then the currency board would issue a local currency for use inside the colony.
An equivalent amount, yes. Let's say West African pounds.
Okay, wait. Let's try to make this relatable. Imagine you have a successful lemonade stand. You earn $100. The colonial government forces you to deposit that $100 into a rival's bank account in another country. And that bank then gives you $100 worth of special lemonade vouchers that you can only use in your local town. Is that roughly the dynamic?
That is an excellent analogy.
That
You gave away the hard convertible currency, which is the engine of global trade, and you got back an IOU in a local currency, which was backed by your own money sitting in London.
But here's the scam's brilliance, as you put it.
The sterling reserves held in London weren't just sitting idle. They were immediately invested in British government stock, earning profit for Britain.
So African labor generated valuable hard currency, which was then sent to London, where it basically functioned as a capital loan to the British Treasury, essentially funding Britain's own economic stability and post-war recovery. And the colony got minimal interest, if any at all.
It was a gift, a continuous forced capital inflow from the colonies to the metropole. Rodney cites these staggering figures. By the end of the 1950s, the British government held $1.446 billion derived from the colony's total sterling balances.
Wow.
That was more than half the total gold and dollar reserves of the UK and the entire Commonwealth at the time.
1.4 billion pounds sterling in 1955, derived from African labor and resources, and just kept in London.
Kept in London.
If that money had been invested locally in African education, infrastructure, irrigation, local industrial development, it would have fundamentally altered the continent's trajectory.
That is the core takeaway from the currency board system. It perfectly illustrates how Africa was systematically funding its own exploitation and the development of the imperial center through legal, non-violent, yet profoundly destructive financial mechanisms.
Okay, so now we move to the modern era. The colonial administrations largely left in the 1960s, but Rodney argues that the system of underdevelopment, the one designed and perfected over 5 centuries, it didn't disappear. Why does he call political freedom flag independence?
Because of the issue of structural continuity. The political event of independence did not fundamentally alter the economic machinery that was established during the colonial era. The systems of trade, finance, and specialized raw material production, they remain largely intact. The railways still flow from the gold mine to the port. The banks are often the same ones, Barclays DCO, just rebranded, and the major trading houses still control the primary commodities.
So the structures themselves, the roads, the laws, the educational system, they were all engineered for extraction, and the newly independent states simply inherited that extraction infrastructure.
They inherited a machine designed to drain them, and this keeps the system locked into the pattern of global trade inequality. The issue of low commodity prices versus high manufactured goods prices that Rodney analyzed still holds true.
Let's revisit the cotton example. How does trade inequality work in the post-colonial world?
The price of an African raw material, cotton, coffee, mineral ore, is kept low. It reflects the long hours of cheap, often unmechanized African labor required to produce it.
So that raw material leaves.
It leaves. It's refined, manufactured, packaged, and branded in Europe or North America, using decades of accumulated technical skill and capital investment. And then it's re-imported into Africa as an expensive shirt or a complex machine or processed food.
So the African continent is effectively paying for European manufactured goods using long hours of its own cheap labor,
while simultaneously paying a premium for the technological skills that were developed using African-derived capital in the first place.
This analysis radically changes how we should view development policy and, crucially, debt. When we talk about foreign capital or aid coming into Africa today, Rodney really challenges what that capital fundamentally represents.
He argues that the colonies were actually generators of capital, not recipients. And this is a critical distinction for understanding debt. Rodney posits that what was recorded as enormous profits expatriated from Africa in one year often came back the next year labeled as capital investment or a loan to the newly independent state.
Can you give us a concrete example of this cycling of wealth?
Sure, take the Diamond Company in Angola. In 1954 and 1955 alone, the combined profits exceeded the company's total invested capital plus 40%.
Wow.
Those profits were immediately expatriated, sent out to shareholders in Portugal, Belgium, and the U.S. So in effect, Africa was providing the capital for Europe's economy.
So when that European investor decided to invest in a new African venture,
They were simply putting back wealth they had just taken out,
Yeah.
and the African government was often then expected to pay interest on it.
so modern development finance or even foreign investment often just represents Africa funding its own exploitation and that of the metropoles, rather than a genuine net inflow of external wealth or aid. The debt structure is often built on recycled African profits.
That's the core realization. The colonial system established a mechanism of surplus extraction that was so efficient and so legal that it continues post-independence, just under the guise of global finance and debt servicing.
And this structural dependence ensures that any poverty or instability that arises in these newly independent nations is almost always framed as an internal failure.
Yes, the enduring narratives of the colonial system continue to frame African poverty and instability as internal deficiencies. Corruption, lack of skills, a return to tribalism.
And this is highly convenient for the beneficiaries of the system.
Of course, it prevents any serious global discussion about the predictable outcome of this structural integration into a global capitalist system that is fundamentally designed for extraction. It is a brilliant way to shift moral responsibility entirely away from the exploiters and onto the exploited.
We should also acknowledge the non-economic damage that independent states inherited. You mentioned the long-term cultural and social damage.
Rodney notes that colonialism fundamentally institutionalized and rigidified what they labeled tribalism. Pre-colonial communities had fluid, complex identities. Colonial administrations often simplified, codified, and even weaponized these identities for administrative control, creating artificial and antagonistic ethnic categories that remain structural problems inherited by independent states today.
And the status of women also deteriorated dramatically under colonialism.
Absolutely. In many pre-colonial societies, women held significant economic privileges, control over certain types of production, and political influence. Under colonialism, their traditional economic roles were often either destroyed or subordinated to the male labor demanded by the colonial state, like cash crop production.
While their political rights disappeared.
Entirely. This institutional deterioration of women's status intensified economic exploitation and left a profound negative legacy on modern African societies.
Rodney's framework is so much more than just African history. It offers these crucial tools for understanding how powerful systems work globally. Let's connect how Europe underdeveloped Africa to the broader themes we explore here at Crisis and Perception.
The first and most important connection is the shift from cultural blame to systems analysis.
Right.
Rodney forces us to look past simplistic cultural or racial explanations for poverty. African technological and political growth was not curtailed by any innate inferiority. It was actively obstructed and suppressed by overwhelming external systemic power.
Development wasn't accidental, and neither was underdevelopment.
Exactly. Both were manufactured outcomes of a power dynamic.
The second essential theme here is the critical role of narratives in justifying inequality.
The narrative of the civilizing mission was not a benign mistake. It was absolutely essential to justifying the massive 5-century transfer of wealth. Europeans could not have engaged in centuries of enslavement and exploitation without believing in their own fundamental moral and racial superiority. Racism was an ideological aspect of capitalism, a necessary intellectual tool to maintain the system of domination.
And Rodney highlights the severe contradiction inherent in that narrative, the hypocrisy between European rhetoric and colonial reality.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think of the great democratic and Enlightenment ideals being talked about in Europe. The French Revolution's cry for liberty, equality, fraternity. Yet at the very same moment, The French revolutionaries were maintaining and intensifying the brutal application of authoritarian, undemocratic, and racist practices toward enslaved black Africans in their colonies.
So that hypocrisy, that vast credibility gap.
Was a necessary psychological component for the ruling imperial class to maintain its function without, cognitive collapse.
The third theme is the intimate relationship between historical amnesia and power. The colonizer rewrites history or just removes the colonized from it entirely.
The process of colonization involved the literal removal from history for Africans. It turned them into passive objects of European study and management. When white anthropologists came to study what they called primitive society, they were examining people whose independent agency and historical trajectory had already been crushed.
So Rodney's work is actively fighting this amnesia.
He is. He's reconstructing Africa's complex pre-colonial history and demonstrating that the loss of political power was the ultimate determinant of underdevelopment. When a society finds itself forced to relinquish power entirely to another, it loses the capacity to determine its own future, and that is the highest form of underdevelopment.
The final and perhaps most hopeful connection is the great contradiction within the colonial educational system itself.
Right. Colonial education was designed with a very limited tactical purpose: to train low-level collaborators, clerks, civil servants, teachers, and to instill deference toward European culture and the capitalist system. It was designed to maintain control.
Yet this very system became the tool for liberation.
It did, because it inadvertently equipped Africans with the conceptual tools they needed for revolution. It provided the educated elite with literacy, a broad understanding of international relations, and a grasp of the philosophical ideals of freedom and democracy that the colonizers claimed to champion.
And this knowledge allowed them to expose the immense credibility gap.
Exactly, between the colonizers' rhetoric and the brutal reality of oppression. The educated African elite, though initially intended to serve, ultimately stood in the vanguard of the nationalist movements, mastering the principles of the very system that had mastered them.
This deep dive into Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa has been incredibly rigorous, revealing system after system, designed not just for profit, but for this perpetual structural imbalance. As we conclude, what is the single most powerful, undeniable revelation that you take away from this monumental work?
For me, it is the absolute confirmation of the non-accidental nature of global inequality. Rodney's analysis reveals that the wealth gap we see today, the persistent poverty, the structural debt, the dependence, it is not a natural state, nor is it an unfortunate failure on Africa's part.
It is the deliberate, historical, and systemic consequence of European capitalism.
Using Africa's resources, labor, and land for its own ascent, European prosperity required active African underdevelopment.
And while the political event of independence, the achievement of sovereignty, was a positive development won by conscious African action against those colonial structures, Rodney suggests that true development remains a continuous struggle because the inherited structures are still there.
Absolutely. Real self-sustaining development requires what Rodney, even writing back in 1973, called a radical break with the international capitalist system.
What does that mean in practice?
It means seizing the initiative, claiming full responsibility for their own destiny, and designing productive systems that generate wealth and skills locally. Systems that benefit African people first, not the metropole.
So we'll leave our listeners with this provocative thought based on Rodney's uncompromising historical analysis. If the prosperity enjoyed by developed nations and the current structure of the global financial order were fundamentally built upon the active, systemic underdevelopment of Africa, what does this imply for the current international legal and financial structures? What does this history demand today in terms of global justice, reparation, and the transformation of the world economic order? Where is the bill for 5 centuries of extraction due?
This deep dive was based on the essential text, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, by Walter Rodney, with an introduction by Vincent Harding.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author's work, or check it out from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.